The first time someone spit at her door, it froze before it hit the ground. Martha Ellaby stood behind the window and watched it turn to ice mid-air. It was January, and the wind screamed across the flats like it was starving. Her cabin, small and boxy and pine-dark, barely showed beneath the crude outer shed she'd thrown up around it, a second skin of raw, unpainted planks leaning half-drunk against support beams. It looked like a hoarder's lean-to, like a barn halfway eaten by termites, or a joke made of wood. The neighbors said she was insane. They said it loud, too, at the general store, at Sunday service, even across the cold when they rode past on horses. One man called it a coffin with windows. Another said her dead husband must have knocked a nail loose in her brain, but Martha didn't answer. She was too busy sealing the air gaps between the shed walls and the cabin roof with old grain sacks and tallow-stiffened cloth. She didn't care how it looked. She didn't care what they said, because she was trying to keep a newborn alive, and the air in Kansas that winter came for children first. The baby cried at night in a voice that barely pierced the cabin's thick silence. Her name was Ruthie, and she'd come 2 months too early, born on a night when even the horses were trembling in their stalls. The labor had nearly killed Martha. No midwife would come up the hill, not since the road turned to solid ice and wind. She'd bled into her skirts while the storm pounded the roof like it was trying to break in. She had passed out on the floorboards. When she came to, Ruthie was already crying. She wrapped the baby in everything she owned. Her late husband Silas's old wool coat, a beaver pelt she'd traded a rifle for, 2 buffalo hide blankets, and her own body heat. Still, the cabin wouldn't hold warmth. The floor was cracked. The chinking between the logs was flaking off in strips. Wind found the corners. No matter how much she fed the fire, it never stayed. And every morning, Ruthie's lips looked blue. That's when she decided to build the shed. Not to store anything, not to work in, but to wrap the cabin like a scarf wraps a neck, a wall around a wall, a roof above a roof, a skin to trap the thin heat trying to rise inside. She worked in the dead of night, so the neighbors wouldn't laugh to her face. She dragged half-frozen planks up from the dry creek bed, stripped nails from old corral fences, and begged tar paper from the blacksmith. She didn't explain. She just nodded, her face cracked from cold, hair iced in silver. No one helped her. It took a week before someone noticed. They laughed, loud. A few rode up the hill just to get a closer look and cackled until their horses pawed the ground, said it was the dumbest thing they'd ever seen, called it her rat box. Wind'll just blow through both, they said. Double the draft. She building a barn for her barn? What's next? A roof for the roof? But Martha kept her head down and nailed shut the last beam. Inside the shed's skin, something changed. The wind still screamed, but the cabin no longer shook. The sound came muffled now, like through heavy fabric. The air inside, for the first time since Ruthie's birth, stopped freezing. The temperature stayed barely above breath, but it stayed. No more waking up to frost on the baby's cheek, no more smoke turning solid in the air. She lit one fire, and it stayed burning. The corners of the room no longer pulsed with cold. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. Ruthie's lips turned pink again. Her cries gained strength. Martha still woke 3 times a night in fear she'd gone cold, but the child was warm every time. Warm enough. Then came the dogs. Sometime in the 3rd week of January, something strange swept through the flats. A sickness or a madness. Martha never learned which, but it killed off animals fast. First rabbits went missing, then chickens turned up half-eaten in their coops, then neighbor dogs began to howl for no reason, nights at a time. The whole valley echoed with it, like something worse than winter was crawling in under the snow. One night, the crying got closer. Martha stepped out onto the shed's outer porch, holding her lantern tight, Ruthie bundled to her chest. 3 dogs stared back from the edge of her clearing. Not hers, not anyone's, ribs sharp, eyes too wide, breath fogging in the dark. They didn't bark, they didn't growl, they just stared. She backed inside. The next morning, tracks circled the shed in wide loops. By the end of the week, no one's dogs barked anymore, because no one had any left. Ruthie came down with a cough the same day the well froze. The shed couldn't stop the weather. It wasn't magic, just planks. But it gave Martha enough of a buffer to do what no one else in town could. Boil water without it icing over in seconds. She fed Ruthie drops of thyme tea, warmed over the stove, rubbed bear grease on her chest, and sat with her back to the cabin's inner wall all night to plug the cold. She didn't sleep. Her fingers cracked from cold. Her throat stayed raw from breathing smoke, but she watched the baby's ribs rise and fall, and in the silence of each breath, she knew the shed had done something no amount of prayer or doctoring could. It had bought her time. When the neighbor boy came begging, Martha thought she was dreaming. He was 12, maybe 13, coat torn, nose bleeding from wind. He'd run 6 miles across the ridge to her cabin, because theirs had frozen over, He didn't ask for food. He didn't ask for shelter. He asked if he could just stand inside her shed, just stand there, in the space between her real home and the makeshift one. We heard yours stayed warm, he said. Mama said it wasn't true, but his hands were purple. Martha let him in. He stood shaking on the sawdust-covered floor, the wind rattling outside like it was furious he'd escaped it. He didn't speak for a long time, just breathed, just felt. Then he started crying. Word spread. The next week, 3 more knocked at her outer shed door, a widow and her 2 boys. One of them had frostbite already. They didn't want to come inside. They just wanted to sleep between the walls. Said it was warmer than anywhere else left in the township. The shed wasn't insulated. It wasn't thick, but it had trapped the warmth in a way nothing else had. By mid-February, 10 people had spent at least one night on the floor of that outer ring. They brought what they could: quilts, jars of pickled beets, a few lumps of coal. Martha didn't ask. She just opened the door. The baby slept through most of it, still warm, still pink, and the neighbors, the same ones who'd laughed, who'd said she was crazy, who mocked her when she bent double in the snow with a hammer in her teeth, now came with quiet voices and downturned eyes. Some didn't even say anything. They just stepped into the shed, took off their hats, and breathed. By March, the shed no longer belonged to Martha alone. It wasn't formal. No one dared say it aloud, but word had spread too far to be hidden. The flats were whispering it in low tones now, that the widow's odd cabin, the one wrapped like a child's Christmas parcel in boards and tar paper, had somehow staved off death. Folks didn't understand how, and they didn't need to. They came with blankets, with old chairs, with cracked oil lamps and borrowed matches. They came walking, or riding, or dragging sleds behind them. They came with children wrapped in shawls, old men wrapped in silence, and mothers who couldn't hide the fear in their eyes. And every one of them, every single one, entered through that outer door and stood in stunned quiet for a moment. Because inside the shed was not warm, but it was less cold than outside. And in a winter like that, even less cold felt like mercy. Martha no longer turned anyone away. She had stopped wondering if the floorboards would hold. She let them sleep in shifts. Some pressed against the shed walls, others curled against the cabin's outer beams. When the stove burned hot inside, heat would seep just enough to make the thin air bearable. It was survival by inches, by degrees. Her baby Ruthie slept through the noise. That's what startled most folks the most, not the warmth, but the peace, the hush of that tiny body breathing, soft and steady, in a world where even grown men cried out from cold. They'd lean close just to hear her, a baby thriving in a season that killed livestock, froze wells, and turned strong men to stone. And they'd look around at the haphazard walls, the crooked rafters of the shed, the sawdust-packed crevices Martha stuffed with horsehair and straw, and they'd go quiet. No one laughed anymore. One woman, the wife of a blacksmith from the south bend of the creek, tried to copy Martha's design. She came one afternoon while the light was still strong and asked, awkwardly, if she could walk around the outer edge of the shed and take measurements. She had brought a bit of charcoal and parchment and kept scribbling and muttering to herself. "I think if I space the joists 4 feet apart," she mumbled, "and maybe add a second tarp for wind seal." Martha watched her for a while from the cabin door, Ruthie on her hip. She didn't stop her. She didn't help either. The next week, that woman's husband came knocking, said she'd gone out to hammer a rafter in place and slipped on the ice, broke her leg clean through. He came not asking for shelter but for rope, said he needed to haul her inside before the coyotes got bold. Martha gave him her only coil without blinking. She didn't know if they finished their shed. She never saw them again. There was a moment, just one, when Martha began to fear what she'd built. It came one night in the second week of March, when the wind had died but the cold had not. The air sat still, suffocating in its quiet, the kind of night where breath sounds like fire and frost grows loud on windows. Ruthie was asleep again, her cheeks ruddy from the fire, her breath tiny clouds above her lips. Martha had just leaned back to close her eyes when she heard it, something moving just outside the shed wall, not fast, not loud, but dragging. She sat up, heart skipping, one hand already reaching for the iron poker by the stove. The shed made every sound muffled, but not erased. She heard it again, a dragging step, then another, then something that sounded like a hand, scraping. Someone was moving along the outer wall, feeling their way through the dark. Martha stood frozen for a moment, then reached for the lantern and inched toward the outer door. She cracked it open, slowly, letting only the thinnest line of orange light spill out into the snow-packed space between the cabin and shed. The shed wall trembled gently in the windless cold. Then she saw it, a man, maybe, hard to say. He was crouched low, coat torn, hair stiff with ice, one hand pressed flat to the boards like he was blind, or half dead. His breath came in short, furious bursts. His other hand clutched something, a bundle of cloth, a child. Martha opened the door wider, just enough. "In here," she said. "Now." The man didn't speak. He stumbled forward, eyes wide, and almost fell through the doorway. Martha caught the child before he hit the ground. She slammed the door shut behind them and dropped the bar. He collapsed against the wall, chest heaving. He said, voice cracked. "My wife froze 2 nights ago. Took me this long to find y'all." He passed out before he could say more. The child in Martha's arms stirred once, then fell silent. A girl, maybe 2 years old, light as feathers. Martha stared at her a long time, then wrapped her in another one of Silas's coats. There was no longer room for pride in the shed. By the 3rd week of March, a dozen people lived in it full time. Another dozen passed through each week, borrowing warmth, dropping off dried corn or frozen apples in thanks. Martha had given up sleeping on the cot. She now lay curled near the stove, Ruthie tucked into a sling strapped across her chest. The girl barely cried anymore, just watched the others with solemn, curious eyes. A little boy, one of the widow's sons, had begun carving faces into the shed's inner beams, tiny stick figures with frozen smiles. When Martha asked him why, he said, "So they know we were here later." Whoever comes after," he said. Martha didn't answer. She touched the beam gently. The next day, 3 more figures had appeared. Food was growing scarce. It had been weeks since any reliable hunting. The ice storm that swept the ridge in February killed most of the wild game. Traps came up empty. The last of the town's flour was rationed weeks ago. Martha fed Ruthie on boiled rice and rendered marrow. She traded her last copper kettle for a half bag of oats. And then the snowstorm hit, the real one, the kind that makes men believe the end has come. It began like mist, just a flurry, and folks sighed with relief. It had been clear for 4 days, which meant bitter cold, so snow was a blessing. But by midday, it thickened. The wind followed. By nightfall, visibility dropped to inches. Then it kept going. 4 days. The storm didn't let up. White buried everything. Chimneys vanished. Trees disappeared into sky. The town vanished from view entirely. The shed groaned under the weight. The roof bent. Inside, the temperature plummeted. Everyone huddled close. There was no sleep, just breath and prayers, and the shiver of cold through bodies too tired to resist. But the shed stood. The shed stood when trees fell, when fences snapped, when windows burst in homes below the hill. It stood when 2 feet of snow swallowed porches, when smoke curled downward instead of up, when men started hallucinating in the cold. It stood when the barn next door collapsed, killing 2 horses. It stood when the outer ring of shingles blew off in one gust. It stood because Martha had built it with the scraps of 100 failures and a single hope. And when the wind finally stopped, the shed still stood, and so did Ruthie, still breathing, still pink. On the 5th morning, sunlight returned. Not warmth, not yet, but light, pure and clean, burning like fire through the clouds. And with it came the sound of feet crunching snow. One by one, doors creaked open. Figures emerged, faces drawn, eyes red from wind. They climbed the hill to see if she had survived, and they saw the shed, battered, half buried, seams stuffed with frozen rags, roof bent but holding, and they saw smoke rising from its center. One man fell to his knees, another wept, because it was true. She had survived, the widow, the baby, the shed. And when the door opened and Martha stepped out with Ruthie cradled to her chest, wrapped in 3 layers of salvaged cloth, blinking into the light, no one said a word. They just bowed their heads. But winter wasn't done with her yet, and neither were the neighbors, because surviving something, even something that kills the rest, doesn't mean they'll forgive you for it, especially not when they didn't think of it first. The snow thawed slowly. At first, it clung to the edges like it was refusing to die. The long drifts turned to crusted ridges, and the ridge path turned to a black ribbon of boot-stomped slush. March bled into April like a wound refusing to close. Every day, the ground coughed up more death. Frozen birds. A wild calf curled against a fallen fence. A man who never made it to the general store, still clutching a prayer in one hand and a frozen tin of beans in the other. Yet from the Ellaby cabin, smoke still rose, and that alone twisted something dark in the hearts of those who'd laughed. They didn't knock the first time. They just stood there, 5 of them, coats still stiff from the cold, hats in their hands but no warmth in their eyes. One man, Aaron Kellum, the blacksmith's cousin, stepped forward and ran his hand across the outer shed wall. "Ugly damn thing," he said, "but it held." Martha watched from the door. She didn't speak. Ruthie was in her arms again, though she was too old now to be carried everywhere. Nearly 5 months, still small, but solid, alive in every way that mattered. Her skin glowed in the firelight. Her breath never shivered anymore. Aaron turned back toward the group and said loud enough for her to hear, "Maybe that's the real trick. Build something ugly and hope no one steals it." The others chuckled, but it was tight, nervous, not like the old laughter. This was closer to a growl, something wounded, something envious. Martha stepped out with her chin high and stared at them until their smiles broke. "You need something?" she asked. Aaron looked at her, just admiring the view, but his eyes never met hers. They didn't ask for shelter, didn't thank her for the lives she saved, didn't mention the nights their children had warmed their boots by her stove. They just left, the snow crunching underfoot, leaving tracks that didn't melt for 2 more days. They came again 2 weeks later, different group this time, wives mostly, one with a baby strapped to her back, face pale with worry. They didn't mock, they didn't talk much at all. They asked questions. "What kind of planks did you use? Did you nail them into the cabin or float them? How much airspace between walls?" Martha answered only what she wanted to, not out of malice, not out of pride, out of caution, because they weren't asking to learn, they were asking to judge. "You used tar, didn't you?" one of them snapped when she caught sight of the shed's patched seams. "Not much," Martha replied, brushing snow off a beam. "Still," the woman said, "that's not safe. Tar gives off gases. Sickens babies." "No sickness in this house," Martha said plainly, turning toward the open door. Ruthie giggled from somewhere inside. Her laughter rang like chimes. One woman flinched, another muttered, "Lucky, that's all." But as they turned to go, Martha watched their faces. There was something bitter in them, not resentment of her survival, but of her solution, because it hadn't been born from wealth, or education, or male wisdom. It had been born from desperation, from a woman alone on a hill with a hammer and no help. And some folks never forgave a woman for solving what they couldn't. The first fire didn't start until May. By then, spring was clawing at the edges of the prairie. The wind had changed. The sun held longer in the sky. Grass pushed through rot and frost. The town began to wake, and with it came the reckoning. Of the 47 homes in the valley, 19 had collapsed under snow. 6 families had left entirely, 2 buried children under maple trees before the thaw, and only 1 home had gone untouched, Martha's. She hadn't meant for the shed to stand out. It was ugly. After all, still leaning, still splintered, still patched in 20 places, and bowing under the remains of winter. But it stood, that was the problem, and as the town stitched itself back together, they began to whisper that it was too ugly to be good, too lucky to be fair, too clever to be safe. When the barn across the ridge caught fire, no one said anything aloud. The flames lit the evening sky, a red gash across the dark. Martha saw it from her porch. Ruthie clutched tight to her hip. She walked to the edge of her clearing and watched as neighbors ran buckets from the river like ants attacking a forest blaze. No one came to her, but 2 men glanced toward her shed as they passed. One spat. Later, someone said it started from a lantern tipped too close to dry hay. Others said the hay had been damp for weeks. Still others, quieter, slower, said it was a warning. Martha bolted her outer shed door that night for the first time since the storm ended. The next warning wasn't fire, it was sickness. Not Ruthie, not her. One of the children who'd stayed in the shed during the worst of the freeze, a boy named Edwin, maybe 6, came down with something strange. A hacking cough, a grayness in the skin, a wheeze that didn't match the weather. The widow who'd brought him to Martha weeks ago returned screaming that her child had been poisoned by shed air, that all the trapped heat and tallow smoke and tar had stolen the boy's lungs. She came up the hill shouting. Martha was feeding Ruthie crushed beans in broth when she heard it. "You sickened him," the woman cried. "You brought in filth with that rat nest." Neighbors gathered, faces in the trees. A few came closer. No one helped. Martha stepped out, apron soaked, hair tied back, hands still holding the spoon. "I fed your boy," she said softly. "I wrapped him in every quilt I owned. You left him on my floor and I kept him breathing. Don't bring poison here." The woman trembled. She stared at the cabin, at the shed, at the window where Ruthie's small face now peeked out with bright curiosity. "You'll see," the woman hissed. "You'll see when your baby chokes too." She turned and vanished into the trees. The others lingered a moment longer, watching, weighing. Then they left. That night, someone ripped 3 boards from the rear shed wall. Martha heard it. She was up, feeding Ruthie, and felt the draft hit her neck like a slap. She grabbed the lantern and stepped outside, heart pounding. Nothing, just the stars. Cold, quiet. But in the morning, the beams were gone, torn free, nails bent backward like fingers, no footprints, just a hollow where snow had been hastily kicked over. She patched it before sunrise, twice the thickness, then started sleeping with the rifle loaded. By summer, the shed was no longer a structure. It was a symbol. Some called it a miracle. Others called it a trick. Some tried to build their own, half-hearted versions with mismatched lumber and poor ceiling. None lasted. The heat of summer made every floor bloom. One shed rotted in weeks. Another collapsed under its own weight. They blamed her, not themselves, not the rush or the shortcuts or the absence of love in their builds. They blamed her. They said she'd kept some secret back. Said she cursed the rest. Said her shed only worked because it was born of widow's grief and baby's blood and the madness of loneliness. They whispered that Silas's ghost must have helped her build it, that it wasn't natural. When the general store refused to sell her salt, she knew it was turning. When a note was nailed to her fence post reading, "Take your baby and leave," she stopped sending letters to her sister in Illinois. No one came to deliver them anyway. And when Ruthie said her first word, "warm," Martha broke down and cried for an hour straight because she knew that warmth was a curse now. But the shed still stood. Through the summer heat, through the stench of rot in the valley, through the angry looks and the quiet threats and the slow unraveling of a town trying to forget its own failure, the shed stood, children still carved into the inner beams. New ones now, ones who hadn't been there during winter, a quiet rebellion, a whispered thank you. She never caught them in the act, but she left a dull knife hanging on a nail, just in case someone wanted to keep carving. And Ruthie grew, slow but sure. Her cheeks stayed pink, her limbs strong. She crawled in the dust between the inner cabin and the shed like it was her own private world. Once Martha found her asleep beside the beam with the first carving, the stick figure still smiling through the wood. And for the first time since the thaw, Martha allowed herself to hope. But hope is flammable, and people are worse. The second fire didn't come with warning. It came with laughter. Not the bitter kind they used in town, not the scoffs they'd mutter under breath when Martha walked into the store, but something louder, joyous, forced. Drunken. She heard it echoing up the slope well past midnight. 4 voices maybe, 5, thick with drink and anger, the way boys sounded when they were trying to dare each other into doing something their fathers never had the courage to. Ruthie stirred at the sound, small arms flailing in her cradle. Martha moved to the window, rifle already in hand. She didn't light the lamp, just watched, a flicker in the tree line, a torch, then another, and then the smell, not of wood smoke, but of kerosene, sharp, greasy, wrong. She didn't shout. She didn't go for help. There would be no help, not from them, not now. She scooped Ruthie from the cradle, pressed the baby tight to her chest, and stepped out into the night. They weren't at her cabin yet. They were at the barn, what was left of it. The same barn that collapsed in February had been little more than a ruin for months now, a frame of blackened wood, snow-crushed beams, and shattered roof. But now it was blazing. Orange tongues licked at what little structure remained. Someone had poured kerosene at the edges to give it life. The heat blew out in wild bursts. Sparks rode the wind like curses. One man whooped, another shouted, "Hell of a summer night!" A third laughed until he couldn't breathe. Then the wind shifted, the flames turned, and every one of them realized, too late, what Martha had known the second she smelled kerosene. The wind was blowing uphill. The first embers hit the shed's south wall, tiny glowing specks carried on the warm draft, soft as falling ash. One landed on the thatch Martha had stuffed into a split beam last month. Another found a dry thread of horsehair tucked into the corner of the roof. She didn't scream. She ran. She grabbed the water buckets from the porch, both half full, and threw the first across the south wall, soaking the planks. The second she flung upward, drenching the eave. The fire hadn't caught yet, but the embers kept coming, carried in waves. Inside the cabin, Ruthie began to cry. The sound pulled something sharp and ancient from Martha's gut. She dropped the buckets, slammed open the shed's outer door, and bolted inside. She passed through the narrow space, the useless ring of wood they'd all mocked, and saw her child's face in the firelight. Not frightened, just watching. Still warm, still pink, but Martha knew warmth could turn on you, fast. The barn fire didn't reach the cabin. It came close. Scorching heat blistered the south side of the shed. Paint peeled, a few boards blackened, but it didn't leap, because the shed stood tall and sealed and solid, an accidental shield. And when the fire burned out hours later, when dawn finally smeared red across the fields, and the last flames curled into smoke, the truth was plain for all to see. The Ellaby cabin still stood, so did the shed, but now the shed was blackened, wounded, and Martha, her dress singed, her hair soaked in sweat, her arms wrapped tight around Ruthie, stood on the porch in full view of every man who came to gawk, and she said nothing, nothing at all. They didn't apologize? Of course not. Men like that never did. They shrugged it off as a prank, a mistake, said they meant no harm, said it was boys being boys, that no one got hurt. so no one should go making a fuss. The sheriff came up the hill that Sunday. He didn't knock either, just stood in the field near the damaged wall and looked up at her. Ruthie was in her arms again, chewing on a strip of linen. The sky behind the sheriff was bright and clean. "You planning to file complaint?" he asked. Martha didn't reply. He squinted. "Wouldn't recommend it. Judge in Wichita won't waste a minute on shed fires, especially not on women who build like that." Still, she said nothing. He cleared his throat. "Folks are asking questions. Let them. Wondering what it is you're trying to prove." Martha held his gaze. "I'm not trying to prove anything," she said softly. "I'm just trying to keep her alive." The sheriff adjusted his belt, shifted, nodded once. "Well, if anything real happens, you let us know." Then he left. That was when she realized. There was no law in the valley, not for her. But word spreads fast when a fire fails to kill. And for every man who resented the shed, there were 3 women who came quietly later, asking to see how it had held. They didn't come with pride, or noise, or curiosity. They came with shame, and quiet desperation, and children in tow. And Martha let them walk around the walls, let them touch the beams, let them trace the lines of smoke where the fire had licked but not eaten. One woman cried, just touching the doorframe. Another asked if she could lie down on the floor inside, just once, to feel what it felt like to be safe. Martha nodded, stepped aside, and that's when she knew. The shed was no longer hers. It belonged to the ones who hadn't been believed, the ones who'd been told to hush, the ones who'd wrapped babies in blankets and prayed the roof wouldn't cave, and that scared the others more than fire ever could. It wasn't long before someone tried again, not with matches this time, with nails, a long plank of rough iron nails, hammered upward through a board and left buried just beneath the snow outside the shed's west entrance. Martha found it by accident, almost too late. One of the neighbor girls, a shy thing named Elsie, who brought jars of tallow in thanks for last winter, stepped on it while carrying kindling to the porch. Her scream cut through the morning like a blade. The nail went clean through her foot. Blood poured like spring runoff. Martha carried her inside, wrapped the wound, boiled cloth in the same kettle she'd used for Ruthie's birth. She burned the nail plank in the stove, not out of fear, out of rage. Elsie's mother came that evening, didn't knock, just stood at the edge of the clearing with tears in her eyes and a small burlap sack in her hands, filled with buttons, hundreds of them. "Can't give coin," she said, "but I can trade." Martha took the buttons, sewed a quilt that week. Ruthie slept under it for the rest of the summer. Then came the preacher, not the usual one. The old man had died in February, lungs full of frost, too proud to accept a bed in the shed. This one was new, young, full of vinegar, and eyes too clear to trust. He arrived on horseback, all black coat and polished boots, holding a Bible like a knife. Said he'd heard rumors, said he needed to see the place himself. "It's not a holy thing you've made," he told Martha as he stood between the shed walls. "It's unnatural." She didn't answer. He walked the ring 3 times, touched the beams, stared at the marks the children had left in the wood. "Blasphemy," he muttered, "shelter made into shrine, no different than idol worship." "Then don't worship it," Martha said flatly. "Just let it stand." He turned to her, eyes sharp. "You built this to prove a woman doesn't need a man." She laughed, once, sharp as frost. "No," she said, "I built it to prove my baby doesn't need to die." The preacher left before nightfall, but the next Sunday, his sermon warned of women who put faith in planks instead of providence. Still, the shed held. Ruthie walked now, not well, more of a stagger, but proud. She liked to trail her hands along the inner beams, tracing the carved figures like they were old friends. Each one was a memory, each one a survivor. Each one a name not spoken anymore in town, but remembered here. Martha added one of her own in late July, a stick figure, with a hammer in one hand, a baby in the other. She didn't say who it was. She didn't have to. The beam held the story. By autumn, the town had changed. You wouldn't know it just walking through. The buildings were the same, the road still churned to mud in the rains, the people still nodded in tight silence when they passed. But something had shifted. The women gathered more often, shared more, trusted one another in ways the men never saw. They whispered in the fields. They planned. They remembered. The shed had taught them something winter never could, that survival didn't come from men on horses, or sermons in chapels, or sheriffs with their arms crossed. It came from nailed planks, from bitter hands in frozen earth, from a mother with a hammer, alone on a hill, building something no one believed in. And when the first frost came again, when the air turned silver and tight, and the firewood disappeared faster than it could be chopped, People started glancing up toward the hill. Some came quietly again, asking for advice. Others came just to walk the ring one more time, to breathe it in. But a few, always a few, still hated it. Hated her, and hated what she'd proved. And they had one more plan left, one more way to make her pay. Because some folks couldn't forgive a miracle, not when it made them look small. The first frost arrived in silence, creeping in like a thief before dawn, icing the edges of every pane in town before the cockerels crowed. When Martha stepped out with Ruthie in her arms, her breath plumed in the dim light and the grass crackled underfoot. Autumn had barely begun, but the wind carried winter's voice again, quieter now, but certain it was coming back. She looked up at the shed. The wood was still scorched on the southern wall, blackened and bent, yet the whole thing stood like a battered sentinel. The inside was patched with spare boards from a collapsed corral and thick quilts of waxed burlap stuffed into cracks. It wasn't beautiful, it wasn't proud, but it had learned how to endure. So had Martha. But as she stood there, watching the frost edge closer to the beams, she knew something was wrong. Not in the shed, not in the air, in the silence. Too perfect. The birds hadn't returned. The wind blew, but it carried no sound of life. Not from the creek bed, not from the town. Not even the old fence line where mice usually skittered through at dawn. It was the kind of silence that came before storms or betrayal. That evening, someone knocked, a rarity. Even rarer, it wasn't a man or a widow or a preacher come to scold. It was a child, maybe 11, red hair, freckled nose, coat too big for his shoulders. He held his hat in both hands and stared at his boots when he spoke. "Mama says I ain't supposed to be here," he whispered. Martha waited. "She says you're cursed." Martha didn't answer. "But she also said you'd tell me the truth about what they're planning." Martha's spine stiffened. She stepped out onto the porch, down the 3 steps, eyes scanning the ridge. "Who's planning what?" The boy looked up, frightened. "I only heard part. Mama said something about Sunday. About finally tearing it down. They don't think you'll fight back." Martha stared at him a long moment. Then she crouched and took his hands. "Tell your mama thank you." He nodded, fled, boots slipping in the dew. Martha stood alone again. They came at sunrise, 6 of them, 2 with shovels, 1 with a hatchet, the others with expressions more hollow than cruel, like they'd already buried the version of themselves that once might have hesitated. Aaron Kellum led them, same man who'd spit the first winter, same man who called her a joke. His sleeves were rolled, his voice rang out like he owned the land. "Step aside, Miss Ellaby," he said. Ruthie clung to Martha's dress. She didn't move. "Town vote passed. This structure's a hazard, unsanctioned, unfit, and stands in violation of common good. You've been warned." "No one warned me. Consider this the warning." Another man stepped forward, younger, not bold but following. "Ma'am," he said, "we ain't here to fight. We just need to take it down. Fire risk, you understand? You could rebuild, proper like, with town say-so, with blueprints. Just..." He trailed off, looked past her shoulder, at the shed, at the wall where children's carvings had multiplied, at the scorched section, the nailed patches, the place where winter had been caught and stopped, and held back by a widow who refused to let her baby freeze. "It held," Martha said, voice quiet, "when nothing else did." "Lucky?" Aaron muttered. "No, built." He stepped forward. So did she, between him and the shed, between 6 men and a wall of splinters that had saved lives. Ruthie pressed her face into her leg, too young to understand, but understanding all the same. "You're outnumbered," Aaron said. "I'm not," Martha replied, and when she looked past them, down the hill, she saw it. Women. Dozens, mothers, daughters, widows, standing shoulder to shoulder, quiet as snowfall, boots crunching grass. They came from the town, from the edges, from the broken homes the shed had once warmed. Some held nothing, some held brooms, some held hammers, none held fear. Aaron turned, blinked. "Now what's this? You're not tearing down what saved us?" one of them called out. "Not again. Y'all didn't lift a damn finger while the rest of us buried children," another woman snapped. "You laughed," a third said. "While she built, you laughed while she bled." The men hesitated. Aaron's face flushed, then paled. "You're gonna let one woman shame this whole town?" No one moved. Then the youngest man, the one with the soft voice, stepped back, dropped his hatchet. "She ain't the one shaming us," he said. Aaron cursed, threw down his shovel. "Fine," he spat. "Keep your ugly little hovel. See how long it lasts." He turned and walked down the hill alone. The others followed, slowly, one by one, until the clearing was still again. The women didn't speak at first. They stood near the shed's ring, walking its perimeter like pilgrims, tracing the carvings. One of them knelt to touch the scorched wall, ran fingers over a child's initials carved in deep. Ruthie toddled among them, laughing. And then someone, Martha never learned who, began to sing. It wasn't a hymn, not a church song, just a frontier lullaby, old as riverbeds, older than towns, soft and strange and sad. Others joined in. The air hummed with it, and Martha, standing beside the crooked doorframe, holding her daughter close, finally let herself cry. Not from fear, not from grief, but from release. Because the shed, the useless thing they mocked, the thing they tried to burn, tried to outlaw, tried to shame, had become more than wood. It had become witness. Winter came again. It always does, and it was cruel. Not as long, not as deep, but cruel, biting through bones, knocking at every door with wind and warning. Chimneys smoked, doors creaked, fences shattered. But the Ellaby cabin stayed warm. The shed had been repaired, reinforced, not just by Martha this time. The whole hill helped. They brought tar paper and saws and fresh pine from the higher ridge. They built a second ring on the east wall, a smoke vent under the top beam, straw-filled bags for the floorboards. They built like she had, with stubborn hands and broken tools and no one's permission. And it worked. The warmth stayed. And this time, the laughter didn't come. Only footsteps, and quiet knocks, and the sound of children breathing softly in the night. In spring, they held a gathering. No one called it a celebration, but they came, with cornbread, with music, with paper flowers stitched from old books and cloth and lace. A woman painted a sign and hammered it above the shed's outer door. It read, "This is how she kept her child alive." No date, no name, just the truth. Years later, travelers would ask why a valley full of timber and craftsmen and strong-backed men kept copying one crooked, ugly structure halfway up a hill. They'd ask why every new home had a second wall now, why children carved stick figures in the beams, why people here survived winters others didn't. And the answer always came the same way, with a smile, with a nod, and a glance up the hill where an old blackened shed still stood like a scar, and a promise. That survival didn't come from permission. It came from one woman, wrapped in grief and grit, building something no one believed in, and doing it anyway, because a newborn girl needed to breathe, and a mother wouldn't let the cold win.